Have you ever looked at your watch collection and realized that the thing that you thought you wanted isn't actually what you want anymore? About a year ago, I owned 6 watches. Today, I own just 3. But here's the part that surprised me. I genuinely enjoy my collection more today than I ever did when I owned 6. Now, this wasn't because I fell out of love with watches. It wasn't because I suddenly became a minimalist, and it wasn't even because I just needed the money. In fact, I think I love watches today just as much as I always have. So, what changed? Over the last year, I made one of the biggest changes I've ever made as a collector. I sold 5 out of the 6 watches that I owned, kept just one, and then intentionally added 2 completely different watches to build a collection that I have today. Now, looking back, there were really 3 major realizations that led me to make those decisions. The first was about one watch that I simply couldn't stop wanting to wear. The second was realizing that my collection had slowly started competing with the life that I was trying to build alongside it. And the third completely changed the way that I think about watch collecting. And honestly, I think it applies whether you own 3 watches or 30. So today, I want to tell you the entire story of this journey. So let's start with the collection that I had before any of these changes happened. So at one point, I had what I honestly thought was my dream collection. It consisted of 6 watches, and every single one of them represented something different about my journey as a collector. Now, that's important to understand because none of these watches were impulse purchases, not a single one. Every one of them had a story, and every one of them represented a particular season of my life. Now, the first watch was my Rolex Sky Dweller. This watch was so much more than just a Rolex to me. It represented an enormous milestone in my life outside of watches. I had worked incredibly hard to build my career, reach some goals that had taken me years to achieve, and it was the same year that I was turning 30 years old. And I wanted to mark that moment with something really meaningful. And the Sky Dweller became that watch for me. Now, beyond the symbolism of it, I absolutely loved what it represented technically. It combined a GMT, an annual calendar, excellent water resistance, and incredible everyday versatility in a package that somehow still felt elegant enough to wear almost anywhere. It was one of those watches that you felt like you could own for the rest of your life and never really need another sports watch. Then there was my Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Perpetual Enamel. Now, if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you already know how much this watch means to me. This was not just another watch purchase. This was actually my grail watch. It represented everything that I had come to gradually appreciate about watchmaking over the years. There were the elegant proportions, the restrained design language of JLC, the incredible symmetry of the dial, and you have hand-executed guilloche beneath the enamel. Of course, there's the engineering required to build an actual perpetual calendar movement and the beautifully finished movement itself. The fact that it measures just over 10 millimeters thick while containing all of that mechanical complexity is incredible. And it wasn't the first form of it. I owned another JLC, Master Ultra Thin Moon, in black. It was simple, it was elegant, and that was the stepping stone to that grail piece for me. And then on top of everything else, the fact was that this particular version was limited to only 100 pieces. It wasn't just a beautiful watch. It was everything I loved about watchmaking, brought together into one watch. Then I had the Grand Seiko SLGA 017. This one actually tells a story within the story because before I owned the JLC, I owned an SLGH 017 Night Birch, and I loved that watch. But when the opportunity came to purchase the JLC, I sold the Night Birch to help fund that. Now, later, I found myself wanting a Grand Seiko back in the collection because I realized how much I appreciated their completely different philosophy when it comes to craftsmanship. Because whereas the Swiss often focus on historical refinement and traditional finishing, Grand Seiko approaches things a little bit differently. They use nature-inspired designs, subtle textures, spring drive technology, exceptional finishing, and limited editions with a distinctly Japanese perspective on beauty. So this skyflake dial that it uses became my way of keeping that appreciation for Japanese watchmaking in the collection. Next, there was the Girard-Perregaux 1966 Orion. Now, this watch may have had one of the most beautiful dials I've ever owned. The aventurine dial on this had this incredible depth to it that constantly changed depending on the light, and it offered something completely different from the rest of the collection. It also served another purpose, though. It kind of gave me an alternate dress watch from a brand with equally incredible watchmaking capability. And in many ways, it occupied similar territory to the Jaeger-LeCoultre. At least that's what I thought at the time. Then there was the Omega Ploprof in summer blue. Now, this was almost the opposite of everything that I just described. It was huge, it was bold, it was purpose-built, and almost comically over-engineered in a way. But I absolutely loved it. I've always had a soft spot for Omega as a brand, and the Ploprof to me represents everything that I admire about them. You know, they weren't trying to make the prettiest looking dive watch. They were trying to make one of the most functional and serious dive watches ever created, and I think they succeeded. It was unapologetically a tool watch. And because it was so different from everything else in my collection, it really brought a kind of variety that I enjoyed. Now, finally, there was the Dan Reuter DR02, and this watch represented something completely different, which is a strong community. Now, if you followed my channel for a while, you know how much of an influence that Tim Masso and the entire community had on my own watch collecting journey. Cheers to you out there, Tim. And Dan is not only an incredibly talented watchmaker, but he's an amazing person. Owning one of his watches wasn't simply about owning the watch itself. It was about supporting someone whose work I admired and feeling connected to a community that had played such a meaningful role in developing my appreciation for watches. So when I looked at this collection, I did not see just 6 watches. I saw 6 chapters of my journey. Every one of these watches represented something that I genuinely valued, which is exactly why what happened next really surprised me. Because despite loving every single one of these watches, something slowly started changing. And it wasn't the watches, but it was me. I didn't notice it at first. And in fact, it happened gradually enough that I almost missed it. Every Monday morning, I would put on my Jaeger-LeCoultre, which I'm wearing today. I'd go through my workday, catch myself looking down at it throughout the day, appreciating that the way the light played across the enamel dial, the symmetry of the perpetual calendar display, the proportions of the case on my wrist, and I genuinely looked forward to wearing it. Then an interesting thing would happen. Tuesday would show up, and because I had 6 watches, I'd rotate on to something else. But something interesting kept happening, and as much as I appreciated whatever watch I happened to be wearing that day throughout the week, I found myself thinking about my Jaeger-LeCoultre. By Wednesday, I wanted it back. By Thursday, I was already looking forward to Monday. At first, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed that that's what happens when you own a Grail watch. But after enough weeks had gone by, I finally asked myself a question that, looking back, changed everything for me. The question was, why am I only wearing my favorite watch one day a week? Now that sounds like such a simple question, but it forced me to confront something I hadn't really admitted to myself. When I first bought the Jaeger-LeCoultre, I thought it would become the centerpiece of my collection. And what I didn't realize was that by continuing to expand the collection around it, I had actually made it harder to enjoy the very watch that represented everything I loved most about watchmaking. It had become my favorite watch, but it had become my least worn favorite watch. And then another question followed almost immediately. If this is already the watch that I most want to wear, what exactly am I still trying to accomplish in collecting? Because if I'm being honest, I wasn't looking for another Grail anymore. I already owned it. And that realization became the first domino to fall for me. Now, that question stayed with me for a long time. If this is already the watch that I most want to wear, what exactly am I trying to accomplish? I didn't answer it immediately. In fact, for a while, I just sat with it. I continued wearing my watches. I continued making videos on this channel, enjoying the hobby, but that question kept resurfacing every single time I went and looked at my watch collection. And eventually, I realized that it wasn't really a question about the Jaeger-LeCoultre. It was a question about my life. Because around the same time, my life outside of watches was beginning to change as well. So if you didn't know, I'm getting married next year. And I knew that I also thought about putting some money towards a car. I wanted to continue building a stronger financial foundation in my life. And as those goals became more real, I found myself feeling something that I don't think I've ever really talked about on this channel before. So this is kind of personal for me. For a while, it felt like I had two competing priorities. On one side, I loved watches. I loved learning about them, talking about them. I've come to love making these videos. I loved the friendships that had come from this hobby. There's the craftsmanship, the history that I loved. And I also loved the excitement of finding that next piece that really spoke to me. Then on the other side, I also wanted to build the life that I was working toward. I wanted to prepare for marriage. I wanted to have financial flexibility. I wanted to continue making smart decisions that would give me more options later down the road. And if I'm being honest, sometimes those two things felt like they were pulling against each other. Every new watch required money. Every new watch required my attention. Every watch became another thing to think about. And it's not that watches are bad. I'm here making this video as proof that they are not. And I think that many collectors quietly experience this tension. Again, it's not because they've stopped loving watches, but because life continues moving forward also. Careers change, their families grow, their priorities evolve, even their goals change. And so the question becomes, where do watches fit into all of that? Now, for a long time, I thought I was looking at those two priorities as though they were opponents, almost like I had to choose one or the other. Either I was a passionate watch collector or I was the person making wise decisions for my future. But then something clicked for me, and I realized that those two things were not actually competing goals. I had framed the problem incorrectly. The goal was never supposed to be, how do I choose between watches and the rest of my life? The goal was, how do my watches support the life that I am trying to build? That one shift changed everything, because suddenly I wasn't asking, can I justify owning this watch? I was more so asking, what role does this watch play in my real life? And that question became the lens through which I looked at every watch that I owned. Once I started asking that question, the answers became surprisingly clear. Not easy necessarily, but clear. And I want to be careful here because I think this is a really important distinction. None of the watches that left my collection were bad watches. Not a single one. In fact, I think they're fantastic watches. And if someone told me tomorrow that they had just purchased any one of those pieces, I would be so excited for them. And I've had some conversations like that on the channel. No, this wasn't about the watches. It was about me. It was about realizing that I had changed. Let's start again with the Rolex Sky Dweller. I still think it's one of the greatest everyday luxury watches ever made. The GMT, the annual calendar, the ring command bezel. It's so cool. The incredible versatility, and perhaps most importantly, everything that it represented to me personally. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of years of hard work and the milestones that led to that 30th birthday of mine. And I'll always be grateful for that. But eventually I realized something. The memory for me wasn't in the watch. The memory was in me. Selling the watch didn't erase what it represented to me. It simply acknowledged that I didn't need to keep holding on to an object to continue appreciating that season of life that it commemorated for me. The watch had fulfilled its purpose in that sense. Now, the Grand Seiko was different. I still think Grand Seiko produces some of the most compelling watches in the world today. Their philosophy of craftsmanship continues to inspire me. Again, the attention to detail, the subtle dial work, and the uniquely Japanese perspective. None of that changed. What changed was realizing that when I had a choice in the morning, I wasn't reaching for it. Not because I didn't admire it, but because I admired another watch even more. Now, the Girard-Perregaux taught me something that I had never expected. And in a way, I had learned this lesson before, but I needed to relearn it again. Because originally, I bought it because I wanted another elegant watch. Something that could stand alongside the Jaeger-LeCoultre and hold its own. And in many ways, I think it absolutely did. But over time, something interesting happened. Every time I wore that Girard-Perregaux, I appreciated the Jaeger-LeCoultre even more. Not because the GP wasn't excellent, it was, but because it helped me clarify my own taste in watches. It showed me exactly why the Jaeger-LeCoultre had become my favorite. So in a strange way, the GP made me appreciate the JLC more than it made me appreciate the GP. And that was actually a gift for me because it helped me understand what I valued most. Then there was the Ploprof. This one was probably the hardest emotionally because I absolutely loved owning it. It was outrageous. It was fun. It was unapologetically functional. I often would say if there was one piece for me that would do it all, it would be that watch. And every time I put it on, it made me smile. But then I asked myself that same question again. What role is this watch actually playing in my life? And the honest answer was not enough. As much as I admired it, it wasn't the watch that I naturally reached for when I wanted to go about my day. Now, the Dan Reuter was perhaps the most difficult of all. And not because of the watch itself, but because of everything surrounding it. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Dan is someone I deeply respect, and the community surrounding his work means a lot to me. Tim Masso and that entire community played a huge role in my own collecting journey. Again, Tim, I just appreciate you. Shout out to you. There was an emotional connection there that went well beyond the watch itself. And yet, this is where that lesson became even clearer for me. Again, community matters. Relationships matter. Supporting great people and great artists in this hobby matter. But even those things couldn't become the primary reason for keeping a watch that no longer fit the broader vision that I had for my collection. Because eventually I realized something. I don't need to own a watch to remain part of a community. The relationships, the appreciation, the gratitude, all of those things are still there. And the watch doesn't necessarily have to. Now, by this point, I had sold 5 of the 6 watches that I owned. The Jaeger-LeCoultre was the only one that remained. Not because it was the most valuable, not because it was the rarest, not because it was the most complicated. It stayed because every morning, it was still the watch I had most wanted to wear. Now, by this point, I had basically sold 5 of the 6 watches. The Jaeger-LeCoultre was the only one that still remained. And it's not because it was the most valuable. It's not because it was the rarest, and not because it was the most complicated. It stayed because every morning it was still the watch that I most wanted to wear. But now another question emerged for me. And that was, okay, well, if this is going to become my everyday watch, where does it need help? And the answer wasn't another luxury sports watch. The answer wasn't another dress watch. It wasn't just another complication of some sort. The answer was, I needed a watch that could do everything that I didn't want to ask my Jaeger-LeCoultre to do. And that's how I arrived ultimately at the Omega Aquaterra Good Planet Edition. This watch wasn't purchased because I needed another Omega, because I do still love Omega. It was purchased because I needed a partner for my Jaeger-LeCoultre. Something I could wear to the gym, around the house, doing yard work, traveling, swimming, doing errands, just basically living life without having to think twice. And because it's titanium, because it's comfortable, it's versatile, and it still carries the level of engineering and finishing that I appreciate from Omega, it became exactly that watch. I wear it almost every day. And not because it's replacing the Jaeger-LeCoultre, but because it's protecting it. It allows the JLC to be exactly what I want it to be. That's my daily watch. and my Aquaterra fills in those gaps. Then there was one final gap, and this is not a practical one for me, but it's an emotional one that's still really important. Because even though I had simplified everything about my collection, I still wanted one watch whose entire purpose was simply to have fun and make me smile. A watch that kind of reminded me why this hobby is supposed to be fun. And that is where the Heinrich Radiance Guilloche Swirl came in for me. An independent German brand, a stunning turquoise guilloche dial. Y'all know I love my guilloche dials. Manual winding, vintage inspired proportions, a watch that immediately is a conversation starter or a super casual piece. It's a watch that's just interesting, and it doesn't have to justify itself through complications or prestige or resale value or any of that. Its job is much simpler. It is there to remind me why I fell in love with watches in the first place. And once those 3 watches were sitting together in my watch box, something felt different. Not because there were fewer of them, but because for the first time, they felt like they belonged to the same life, mine. Now that I've lived with this collection for a while, I can honestly say something that I didn't expect to happen. I don't think I love watches any less than I did before. If anything, I think I appreciate them even more. And that might sound strange considering I just sold 5 of the 6 watches that I used to own. Because I think when most people hear that, they naturally assume one of 2 things. Either I got tired of collecting or must have really needed the money. And candidly, neither one is true. I still spend my evenings and days reading about watches. I still love learning about movements. I still find myself fascinated by the engineering, the history, the craftsmanship, the design. I still get excited when new watches are released. You've seen recent videos about that. And I still enjoy going to watch events, talking and connecting with other collectors, and making these videos for y'all every single week. None of that has changed, but what changed was the role that watches play in my life. And looking back, I think that's the part that took me the longest to understand. For years, collecting almost existed as kind of its own separate project. There was my career, and then there was my relationships, and then there were my financial goals and my future. And then over here, there was this watch collecting, almost like it was operating independently of everything else. And every time I thought about buying another watch, it felt like I was weighing 2 different versions of myself, the watch enthusiast and then the person trying to build a life. And sometimes it felt like those 2 people wanted very different things. One wanted another incredible watch, the other wanted to prepare for marriage and a longer term future. Those felt like competing priorities. But eventually I realized that they never should have been, because my watches were never supposed to compete with my actual life. They were supposed to support it. And that realization changed everything. Today, my watches support my life by bringing me joy every day. They support it by bringing me a creative outlet through this YouTube channel. They support it by introducing me to incredible people that I never would have otherwise met. And they support it by giving me something that I genuinely enjoy sharing with all of you. And that's what they were always supposed to do. Not become another goal that constantly demanded more money, more attention, more acquisitions, more chasing. And that's why I think, surprisingly, I don't spend nearly as much time wondering what watch will come next for me. Instead, I spend far more time simply enjoying the ones that are already here. As I reflected on everything that's happened over the past year, I realized that this was not really a story about selling watches. This was a story about understanding myself. When I first got into this hobby, I think I approached collecting the way that many of us do. I wanted to experience everything. A great sports watch, a beautiful dress watch, something from Rolex, from Grand Seiko, something from an independent, something different and with complications and colorful. Every watch represented another part of the hobby that I wanted to explore. And honestly, I don't regret any of that, because every one of those experiences taught me something. The Sky Dweller taught me about celebrating important moments in my life. The Grand Seiko taught me that there are different philosophies of craftsmanship that can be equally beautiful to the ones that I already love. The Girard-Perregaux taught me what I valued most in elegant watch design. The Plo Prof reminded me that watches can simply be massive and a statement piece and fun. And the Dan Reuter reminded me how meaningful this watch community can be. So none of those watches were mistakes. They were all teachers. And eventually they taught me enough that I could step back and see the bigger picture for myself. I started this video by saying there were 3 realizations that changed everything. So again, the first was discovering that I couldn't stop wearing my Jaeger-LeCoultre. The second was realizing that my collection had started competing with the life that I wanted to build. But the third one, the one that took me the longest to understand, is the one that I think will shape every collection I own from this point forward. A great watch collection isn't built around watches. It's built around a life. And that sentence has become the lens through which I now look at every watch I own. Because today, I don't ask, is this a good watch? I ask something much simpler, which is, what positive role does this watch play in my life? My Jaeger-LeCoultre reminds me every single day why I fell in love with this hobby. It encourages me to slow down, to appreciate the craftsmanship, to wear something that genuinely reflects my taste. Then there's the Omega. It kind of allows me to live my life without worrying about a watch at all. It goes with me to the gym, around the house, traveling, doing the errands, all those things. It just quietly supports everything that I do day to day. And then the Heinrich reminds me that collecting should never become so serious that it stops being fun. It sparks conversations, it inspires me to be creative, and it makes me smile every time I get to wind it. Every one of those watches has a purpose. Not because I assigned it one, but because it naturally supports the life that I am actually living today. And I think that's where I was getting it wrong for a long time. I was trying to build a collection that covered every possibility, a collection that kind of prepared me for every hypothetical version of myself. Maybe someday I'd wear this, maybe one day I'd need that, maybe someday I'll become this kind of collector. But life doesn't ask us to live hypothetical lives. It asks us to live the one that's right in front of us today. And once I stopped building a collection around possibilities and started building one around the life that I was actually living, everything became simpler for me. Again, not because I own fewer watches, but because every remaining watch had a reason to be there. Every watch had a job. And together, they make my life better, not more complicated. So if there's one thing I'd encourage you to think about after watching this video, it's not whether you should own 3 watches or 6 or 10. This video is not about numbers. It's a video about alignment. So ask yourself a different kind of question. Not what should I buy, but instead ask yourself, does my current collection support the life that I'm actually trying to build? Because your answer might be more watches. It might be fewer. It might mean selling just one. It might mean buying one that you've wanted for years. There's no right number. There's not a perfect formula here. There are only watches that genuinely enrich your life. And if you can build a collection around that, I think you'll discover something that took me years to understand. The goal was never to own as many great watches as possible. The goal was to build a life that I genuinely love living and to let my watches become a part of that story. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do like the video and subscribe to my channel. And I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments on this. Has your watch collection ever changed because your life changed? Or maybe another way to ask it is this: do your watches support the life you're trying to build, or have they started competing with it? I genuinely think that that's one of the most important questions that we can ask ourselves as collectors. Again, thank you so much for being here, and I'll talk to you all next time. Bye-bye.